Well, welcome to our Messiah Nation Wednesday Wise. Thank you guys for joining us. Thank you for supporting our channel. Thank you for everything that you do to help us do what we feel like the Lord wants for us to do. And we thank you for just keeping with us and watching and sharing and doing all the things that make this channel grow. So we appreciate that. Tonight, we want to talk about something on our Wednesday Wise that you've probably heard before. I titled tonight, Easy Yoke, Light Burden. And we're talking about a specific verse that comes to us from Matthew chapter 11. So if we go over to Matthew chapter 11, it comes to us this way in the New American Standard 1995. It says, "Come to me, all who are weary." This is Yeshua, Jesus talking. "And heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest for your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Now we're discussing this particular verse because I've heard this a lot over the years where someone says, see, Jesus says right here that his yoke is easy and his burden is light. So Jesus doesn't want us to obey the law, right? Because the law is difficult and the law is heavy and the law is burdensome. So he can't want us to follow the law. So here's the question: is that in fact true? Because he is definitely separating himself from something, right? Because he says, my burden is easy, my yoke is easy, my burden is light. So there's something that he's talking about that is not easy, it's difficult, and something that he's talking about that is not light, but in fact it is very heavy. So let's look at the context of this verse. If we back up a few verses and see what is being said here. Is that in fact what Matthew is talking about? It says this in verse 25. It says, "At that time Jesus said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, that you have hidden these things from the wise and intelligent and have revealed them to infants." Okay, now let's stop there just for a second, because he's not talking about people who are actually wise and intelligent, because if they were actually wise and intelligent, then they would see the truths that can be revealed to infants. But in fact, they think of themselves as wise and intelligent. So in their own eyes, they're wise and intelligent. And then the ones who view themselves as children, simple, they're the ones that are understanding. Verse 26, "Yes, Father, for this way was well-pleasing in your sight. As things have been handed over to me by my Father," again, this is Jesus talking, "and no one knows the Son except the Father, nor does anyone know the Father except the Son, and anyone to whom the Son wills to reveal him." Okay, so this is an interesting picture here, because the context of the verse, his yoke being easy, his burden being light, is the fact that he is saying that the people who think of themselves as wise and intelligent are going to miss it. The people who think of themselves as little children or come to him as little children are the ones that will understand it. Furthermore, he says that he and the Father pretty much in this verse are one. You can't see the Father or know the Father unless you know the Son, and you can't know the Son unless you know the Father. So here's the question we need to ask ourselves: how then could he be referring to the law in this context if he is revealing the Father? Could he be saying that his burden and his yoke is different than the law of God that was laid on the people? That makes absolutely no sense, because he just was equating himself and his Father as one, right? So now we have to ask ourselves again, he is separating himself from something. So what is that? Well, if we go over to Matthew 23, we're going to see something in the same context that gives us a little bit of insight. He's going to begin to talk to some people here, and he says this in verse 13, "But woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you shut off the kingdom of heaven from people. For you do not enter in yourselves, nor do you allow those who are entering to go in. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you devour widows' houses For a pretense you make long prayers, therefore you will receive greater condemnation. Okay, so we see who he's talking to, who he is addressing here are scribes and Pharisees, or people he refers to as hypocrites. Okay, now all of us have dealt with people we think are hypocrites, but he's going to give us his definition of hypocrites, and he is separating himself from these people because look at what they're doing. They're making it more difficult. They are making the burdens more difficult on the people. Right? So let's keep reading here. Verse 15. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, because you travel around on sea and land to make one proselyte or one convert. And when he becomes one, you make him twice as much a son of hell as yourselves. Wow. Okay, so this is what he's leveling against them here. Verse 16. Woe to you, blind guides, who say, whoever swears by the temple, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the gold of the temple is obligated. You fools and blind men, which is more important, the gold or the temple that sanctified the gold? And whoever swears by the altar, that is nothing. But whoever swears by the offering on it, he is obligated. You blind men, which is more important, the offering or the altar that sanctifies the offering? Okay, so he's telling them, you guys are in your self-perceived wisdom and what you think of yourself as being wise, you are missing the simple points here. Okay, now verse 23 says this. Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe mint and dill and cumin, and you have neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness. But these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. You blind guides who strain out the gnat and swallow the camel. So what were these hypocrites doing, right? He tells us here. They were doing all of these things, but notice what he said. That they should have been focusing on the weightier provisions of the law. So here's the question. How can he be saying that that the law is what is burdensome, the law is what is heavy, the law is what is difficult, if he's telling them that all of the weight and heaviness that they're laying on them shouldn't have been done, but in actuality what they should have been focusing on was the law? That's what he just said in the verse that we just read. Though you should have, and you neglected the weightier provisions of the law, justice and mercy and faithfulness, but these are the things you should have done without neglecting the others. So they weren't doing these things, right? They were going to these specific things that they had made traditions, and they were not following the law of God, and therefore they were laying heavier burdens on the people. What were they doing, in fact? Well, let's look at what this hypocrisy was doing. It was creating a yoke that was heavy and burdensome. It was creating a burden that was heavy and not able for them to bear, because they were shutting off the kingdom to others, but they wouldn't enter the kingdom themselves. This is what hypocrisy is, okay? That they wanted to teach all of these things that were their traditions to keep people out of the kingdom, even though they wanted to get into the kingdom. The Pharisees, the scribes, these hypocrites, they were not wanting to enter the kingdom themselves. They were wanting to put their own teachings, their own traditions in the way of people, so that those people would have to bear those heavy burdens and would not be able to enter into the kingdom. They devour widows' homes, it says. What is that saying? They're taking advantage of the weak, right? They're making pretentious prayers or pretentious services, right? They're doing things just for show, right? Lots of this in the church today, right? Not probably where you go, but there are lots of people that this is their thing, right? They're putting on a show every Sunday, right? They've got a scripted message that has 3 points and 4 poems, and you're supposed to cry here and laugh there and do all of these different things, right? So that's what he's saying, that is part of the hypocrisy of the scribes and the Pharisees. And it's making it more difficult for the people, right? He says they're disciples. They disciple people into worse followers of The Father, right? The people that they disciple, the people that they go and win, they turn them into worse people according to the qualifications of Yahweh than they were to begin with, and even than they are themselves. Why? Because they're laying heavier weights and burdens on these people. They're majoring on the minors. What is it talking about? Doctrinal dogma. The mint and the cumin. You can read later when he talks about the fact that that they want to basically get rid of the law of one of the 10 commandments that talks about honoring your father and mother because you were supposed to care for them. And he says anything that you would have used to care for them, you're saying to the people, it can be counted as Corban if you give it to the temple. Well, what are they doing? They're literally taking money away from people who need it and using it for their own benefit. Why? Because they are doing exactly what the law says not to do. Okay, now if you go into the first 5 books of the Bible and in the prophets, you can find all of these things that he's mentioning here are the exact opposite of what is prescribed in the law of God. So, and finally, they're neglecting the weightier matters of the law. So again, here we are in a place where we are asking ourselves, I heard it preached over and over and over. See, Jesus came to do away with the law because it was burdensome, even though in Matthew chapter 5, 17 through 19, we hear Jesus himself say that he did not come to do away with the law, right? So what is happening here? Well, let's look at 1 John 5, and let's look at, again, we're still looking at this idea of the law being the burden that is laid on people. Well, John says this, whoever believes that Jesus is the Christ is born of God. And whoever loves the Father loves the child born of him. So again, it's kind of that same language that Jesus said back in Matthew 23, where Matthew 11, where he talks about the context of the Father and the Son being one. You see one, you understand the other. You understand one, you see the other. By this, we know that we love the children of God when we love God and observe his commandments. For this is the love of God, that we keep his commandments, and his commandments are not burdensome. Wow. So it says it plain as day right there. His commandments are not burdensome, for whatever is born of God overcomes the world. And this is the victory that has overcome the world, our faith. Now you can go over to James later and read that actually there is no faith without the works of the law, and there is no works of the law without faith, right? And these two are supposed to play hand in hand with one another, right? So we're talking about this burden and this yoke that is easy and light, right? So let's go back. Let's look at another piece of scriptural evidence of what is happening here, right? If you look at this map, you'll see a place called Shechem right here in bold. Shechem is a place that is mentioned in the Bible over and over in the Old Testament, and it literally means shoulder. Okay, what do you bear a burden with? You bear it with your shoulder. When the people were carrying the Ark of God, where were they carrying it? On a pole on their shoulder. When they were moving the tabernacle from place to place throughout the wilderness, where were they moving that on their shoulder? They were doing that, or they were putting it on donkeys and having the donkeys carry it. Whatever the case, they were moving things. They were bearing burdens with their shoulder. Now, here's what's interesting is if you look at this map, you will see that Shechem is right in the middle between two mountains, Mount Gerizim and Mount Ebal. Now, why is that significant? Well, it's significant because when the Lord brings them into the land, he brings them through this region, and he says that I'm going to show you that there is a mountain of blessing, Mount Gerizim, and there is a mountain of cursing, Mount Ebal, and you have to decide which mountain you are going to live on, right? You have to decide which burden you're going to bear. Are you going to bear the burden of all of the curses, or are you going to bear the burden of the blessings at Mount Gerizim? So if you know the story, you can go read it. But he splits 6 tribes, 6 on Mount Ebal, 6 on Mount Gerizim. If you read historically, Mount Gerizim was supposed to be very beautiful and fruitful, lush and full of life. Mount Ebal was exactly the opposite. It was not. It was just rocky and difficult terrain. It was not pleasant whatsoever. And so we read this in Deuteronomy 30. It says this in verse 15, God talking, see, I have set before you today life and prosperity and death and adversity. In that I command you today to love the Lord your God, to walk in his ways, to keep his commandments and his statutes and his judgments, that you may live and multiply, and that the Lord your God may bless you in the land where you are entering to possess it. So here is what we have to ask ourselves: which one is the greater burden, right? If we're talking about a heavy burden versus a light burden, a difficult yoke versus an easy yoke, which one is more difficult, the bearing blessings or bearing curses? Okay, it's pretty simple to answer that question. The Lord laid before us his law and his ways so that we could bear blessings and not bear curses, right? And if you even look at the way that this is put together, he says it's very easy. Later on, he says, choose life, right? So that you can live. I'm going to make it real easy for you. I'm going to take all the guesswork out for you. So really what it's coming down to is our decision. Are we going to follow a difficult road that is full of curses, and it's made difficult because we are trying to find ways around doing what God said, just like the Pharisees did? Notice what he said to them, that you should have been doing the works of the law, but you weren't. You were making things more difficult for people who were trying to come into the kingdom, right? So it's very interesting because this thing kind of comes full circle. And if we look at Matthew 21, listen, he tells us his yoke is easy, his burden is light. But look at Matthew 21. This took place to fulfill what was spoken through the prophet. This is from Zechariah. Say to your daughter, O Zion, behold, your king is coming to you, gentle and mounted on a donkey, even on a colt, the foal of a beast of burden, right? Because this was the animal that would carry burdens or carry weights or carry whatever from place to place. Probably carried contents of the tabernacle, right? The huge curtains or the connection pieces that went from piece to piece. These things were being carried on a beast of burden. Verse 6 says this: the disciples went and did just as Jesus had instructed them, and they brought the donkey and the colt and laid their coats on them, and he sat on the coats. Jesus sat on the coats. Most of the crowd spread their coats in the road, and the others were cutting branches from the trees and spreading them in the road. So here's what's amazing, right? Now this comes full circle. What do I mean by that? Well, that word coats is a simple word meaning clothing, right? Or covering. If you go back and look at the Old Testament, it's actually used in the place where in the understanding of where Adam and Eve have sinned, right? We understand from the New Testament that sin is transgression of the law. So they have sinned, and now they are in a place where they are in need of covering, right? They are in need of clothing because they have found fault with themselves. Well, here comes the Messiah who is going to exchange that yoke of sin, exchange that yoke of curses, exchange that burden of consequences, right? And disobedience. He's going to exchange it for his yoke that's easy, his burden that is light. So now people are taking the coverings that were given to Adam and Eve to cover their sin, and now they're putting those back on the beast of burden. They're laying it back on the dirt where Adam and Eve came from, and they're understanding that the Messiah is the one that is actually going to bring now an easy yoke and a light burden, because he is the one that is gentle and meek and humble. And so he is the one that is not going to just require something of us that we cannot do, but in fact, what he's going to do is he's going to give us the ability to fulfill the requirements that he's asked of us. That is what makes his yoke easy and his burden light. Because remember what he said. He said, come to me, all who are weary and heavy laden, I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and humble in heart, and you will find rest to your souls. For my yoke is easy and my burden is light. Man, this is go study this stuff, because there's so much more I could say about this. But basically what I wanted to communicate to you tonight is that this was not in any way talking about unhooking from the law. As a matter of fact, if you look at the word burden there, it's actually an invoice, which is part of a freight, right? So there's something that needs to be paid for as part of the freight, something that was delivered, right? Or a task or a service, right? So he's saying what you are going to have to, the burden that I'm going to ask of you is not too difficult for you, because I've already handled giving you now the grace. My grace is sufficient for everything that I'm going to ask of you. That's what makes his yoke easy, yoking to him, coming under the submission of him as King and Lord, and then walking in the burden that he sets before us, because he's already paid that invoice. And now we just get to be obedient to what he's already done for us. So I hope that made sense to you. I hope something that I said helped maybe break this up a little bit easier. He is not talking about unhooking from the law of God. And in fact, there are so many clues in the context that tell us the exact opposite. So let's walk with him. Let's obey his commands. Let's do what he's asked us to do, and trust that now, because of the gift of Messiah, we now have the deposit of the Holy Spirit that is allowing us now the power and the grace to walk in truth and not to walk in the curses of disobedience. Amen. Amen. God bless you guys. Again, thanks for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.